In this video, I'm going to be stepping through the process of modeling a simple 3D object. I'm going to go through different tools, but I'm also going to discuss the technique of approaching how to 3D model this object. So the object I chose that would work very well with this is going to be this steel drum. We are going to go through the process of blocking it in and then refining the features. It's, at first glance it seems very simple, but if we take a closer look at it, we do have these nice elements that are sticking out. They're on these ridges, and it even has a top element of like a little plug that goes into there, into the top of it. So two of them. That's going to be kind of fun to work on. We're not going to go too detailed with this plug. We're just going to make a really simple one, since this is kind of an intro sort of modeling demo. The one nice thing about working from reference images like this, especially if you look around a lot to find them, is that we can sometimes find information that is extremely useful to get us started. And specifically with this steel drum, is this website does have its dimensions. So we have its height and diameter in inches. We'll be able to use those to start our primitive to be really close in size to what it actually needs to be, because we should always be modeling as if it is true to life size. Models work a lot better in game engines if they are the size they're meant to be in the real world in the game engine. So 33 inches high, 22.5-inch diameter. Maya does work with centimeters, so we will need to translate this to centimeters. You can just Google inches to centimeters and it will have a little tool for you. So 33 inches high is going to be roughly 83.82 centimeters. I'm going to round that up to 84 centimeters just to make it a little bit easier for ourselves. And 22.5 inches diameter is about 57.15. Since we do need to actually work with a radius in Maya, not a diameter, I'm going to just make this an even 58 so that it's a little bit easier to split. So a radius for 58 would be 29 centimeters. So 29 centimeters, and what was that first one? 29 centimeters, 84 centimeters. So let's go to Maya and let's create our primitive. So I'm just going to click here to create my cylinder. I'm not going to go into the settings, how you can click the little extra dialog box. I do prefer to just create it that way and then go to the attribute editor and find the correct node to adjust it here. So I think we said the radius was going to be 29 and the height was 84. I gotta check again real quick. There you go. And yeah, it looks pretty close to what the picture was. So we do know that we have an accurately sized primitive to start with. The other thing I do want to change on here is the subdivision axes. I want to give it some more so that we have a nicer shape to it, like rounder. Then this is a little bit faceted, so this is a larger object. We can add some more. I do prefer to keep my cylinders, spheres, etc. For the subdivision axes in powers of 4, so that if I need to, I can easily divide these into quarters. It can be a little bit easier to line up with rotations. So I'm going to jump it up from 20 to 36. That is a nice number to work with, and we have a nice smooth circle to it now. Okay, so we have the basic shape. I do want to remember to rename this, so I'm going to call this steel drum so I don't forget what this is supposed to be. And I'm going to hop on over to the modeling toolkit. What I want to talk about before we actually jump into modeling is a really important concept. not just for 3D modeling, but also for working with game engines. And that concept is pivot points. Pivot points are extremely important. It's important to know where it is on your object. It's important to know how it affects your object. So the pivot point is where the gizmo is located. So we can see by default, the pivot point is usually placed in the very center of the object. So we can see that when we move it, we're actually moving it by that little point right there. That's a lot more obvious when we start using the rotate tool. It rotates around that pivot point. Same thing with the scale. The scale tool scales based on the location of that pivot point. And in general, you do not want to keep your pivot point in the center of your object. The reason is when you import this into a game engine, if you've done any work in Unity or Unreal moving objects around in a game engine, the game engine actually does its transforms based on its pivot point as well. So let's say we drop in, I'm just going to put this plane in just for a demonstration. You do not need to make this plane if you're following along with the demo. So let me make this real quick, just a giant plane. We'll pretend this is our game engine. And we've placed our model. We're trying to place the model on the floor. It is very hard to know that it is exactly on the floor. In fact, we have to kind of eyeball it. We might have to try to type in a weird number, but in most game engines, if you have a nice pivot point and you try to drag it around, it will kind of naturally snap. So like when you drop it in the scene, it's going to be halfway. If you try to move it around, it's going to be kind of sunken into your terrain or floor, where if we put that pivot point in a much nicer spot, it's going to make our life so much easier when we do eventually put this into a game engine. So where do we put pivot points? Your pivot point for the majority, I would say probably 95% of the things you model should be at the bottom of your model. So we would want it here. The usual exceptions for pivot points are if it's not really meant to be sitting on the ground. If you were, for instance, modeling a frame, like a wall frame with a mirror in it or a picture, you would want that pivot point to be on the back of the picture so that when you're placing it, it's going to be moving based on that pivot point. It's a lot easier to place it on the wall. Or, a ceiling light, you'd want that pivot point to be at the very top where it would be coming in contact with the ceiling. Other times it might be in a strange place if it is meant for snapping together to other objects. Like if you're making a pipe set, you might want them at the end of your pipes so that you can easily snap them together with other pipes. So the steel drum is meant to sit on the ground. So let's move that pivot point. And this is something that you should be mindful of and constantly thinking about is where is my pivot point? So I'm going to show you a couple techniques on how to change that. This one is very easy because we have a vertice right where we want it, the middle bottom. And a lot of times, a lot of these models that you're going to be making, it should probably be in the middle bottom. That would be the easiest way to place them and know exactly where they are. If it's somewhere arbitrary, like over here or something like that on the bottom, it might be harder to like line things up nicely or move things around nicely. You sometimes might want it in a middle corner if it is meant to kind of snap together, but we can get to that in another lesson. But I believe all the objects you are creating today should be in the middle bottom of your object. So let's move this. What you want to do, you want to be at the object level. We do not want to be in any of the component levels. We need to be at the object level. We want to get our move tool. And then over here underneath move settings, we can just click edit pivot. And notice that our gizmo changed. So none, yes. We get the little box around our pivot point. So let's move this now to snap to our pivot because we want it right there. We can't, notice we can't come in and type in anything, so like we can't manually tell it where to go. So what I can do, if I have a vertice I want it to go to, I can easily hold down the V key and notice that this does change to a little circle. You see that? I can then grab it, and I know I'm grabbing it because it's kind of highlighted. I'm going to click and hold, and it's going and pull down, and it will snap. I can then release and turn off edit pivot. This is now at, you see how now that my gizmo is at that location. So, and its position changed. Notice now it was at the origin at 0, 0, 0. It is now at negative 42 because it's no longer, you know, the pivot moved to the bottom. So I can easily move this back up to the origin. It's always a good idea to work at the origin for a lot of different reasons. Numbers stay nice, it's easier to find things, but we have successfully moved that. So another technique, you might not always have a thing to snap to in the center, you know, center bottom. So you might have to snap it to not a vertice. This is where you have to be a little bit thinky and kind of remember some things. And this is why I do suggest keeping a little scratch pad of paper next to your desk with a pencil or pen so you can write down little notes to yourself. Because what I need to know now is I need to know what the height of this is, and specifically I need to know what half the height is. Since we have this right in the middle, what we can do is move this up, half its height, and then we can snap it to this grid. So if I don't remember, I can always go back to my attribute editor and see that the height is 84 centimeters. So half of that would be 42 centimeters. So I'm going to move this up to 42. And we can see it is sitting nicely on that grid. So we can now use the grid to place our pivot point. So I'm going to click Edit Pivot. And before I held down V to snap to vertex. To snap to grid, you hold down the X key. And notice it does change to the little circle. And I can then move this and notice it is snapping now to our grid. I might need to zoom in a little bit. And I'm just using the middle mouse scroll to see that a little bit better. And I'm going to make sure it is on there and then turn off Edit Pivot. And we can see that now its location isn't at 42, it is at 0 because now that pivot point is there. So two different ways to do it. It is very important to keep track of your pivot points. So now if I were to scale it, it is scaling based off of that. It also would be easier to rotate because it's kind of rotating on that point. So it might be easier for me to do rotations if I was trying to position this in a different way. All right, so I also want to show you another really important thing. When we are changing pivot locations and we're scaling and we're rotating, we're actually changing things in our transform. So even though, notice, if I go to the Move tool, we are at the location of the origin, 0, 0, 0. If I go to the attribute editor, notice that it's telling me I actually translated it at 40, it's at 0, 42, 0. So I did move it, but it's technically at the origin. So this kind of is where it keeps track of all of our translate, rotate, and scales. And a lot of times we don't want to keep this. Like we don't want it to actually think we moved it 42, even though we changed the pivot point, but we did technically move it. We need to kind of zero this out back to nothing. And we do this by freezing the transform. And this is something you kind of need to get into the habit of you should do this every once in a while, is freeze your transform. Especially if you fix your pivot points, you want to freeze your transform. And that button is right here. It's the snowflake that's a 0, 0, 0. That's a very easy thing to remember. Like it's a nice little icon to remember. It's also underneath, I can never find it, modify, freeze transformation. So either place, I kind of prefer just to click the snowflake. So you see that 42? If I click freeze transform, it sets it back to 0. So now it's kind of like this is the correct orientation where nothing is rotated, nothing is scaled, nothing is translated. We've reset it. This is its starting transformation. Something else we also have to keep an eye on is I'm going to expand this. Notice that the more that we do stuff to our model, the more nodes we get up here. So, we have our general start stuff. Now we have this transform geometry. The polycylinder is what we started with, but I don't know if you saw that when I was doing things, it actually added another node. We don't want to, this is kind of meant that we could go back in history and make changes to things. So I'm going to do a real quick tool. You don't need to know what I'm doing right now. I am going to show it later. I just want you to see it change. So remember, it looks like this up here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a connect, and then I'm going to go back. And notice we have this poly split node now. And this was that tool I just did. And again, I will demonstrate what the tool does later. But the purpose is that we could go in and make tweaks to it that if we wanted to after the fact. But after a while, this does kind of add up. Let me undo that. See how it appeared, disappeared. If I redo it, poly split, undo it, it disappears. We don't want to have a whole bunch of nodes because you will be doing a lot of commands to this. It starts making things run slower, and it starts sometimes having issues when we get to more complex things of it just not working correctly. So what we want to do is we want to delete out all of the history of these nodes, and we do that in a very specific way. If we have our model selected, actually let me have this selected. If you watch all of these, the delete history is right here. Delete by type history. Delete construction history on the selected objects. So we can just click that and watch how all of those disappeared so that we just have now our bare bones. One of the things you should notice, it did delete out our initial polycylinder. You really should not go in and change this after you get your basic shape anyway. Really strange things happen. So that's fine that that got deleted. So you have to make sure that you are good to go after, before you hit that or do anything to it. So we now have our nice, ready to start modeling shape. Okay, so let's look at our reference images again. Let's go back and let's take a look. So we have, two of these lips, at the bottom. We have these ridges in the middle. So let's start by doing these ones in the middle. They look pretty fun. And what we need to do is we need to add some extra cuts in them. We need to add some extra edge loops around so that we have the geometry to model. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do this, and I'm going to try to touch on a bunch of them. You might hear different ways to do it, but for us, the easiest way to approach this one is they are pretty evenly distributed. They look like they're basically, a third, a third, a third. So we want to be able to kind of have the program place them correctly for us. We don't want to have to try to eyeball those. We want to do them nicely. So I'm going to go to my edge select, and I need to select the ring around them. And, we could click. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking one, I'm holding Shift, and I'm double clicking the one next to it. And this will ring select all the way around. Another method I could do, since this is a very simple object, I don't really have to worry about selecting things I don't want, is I could just click and drag a box and it will select all of those. So 2 different ways to select. So the tool I'm going to use is going to be the connect tool right here. So I'm going to click connect and we get some options down here. Notice it does put it right in the center, which is really nice, but I don't want it in the center and I need 2 of them. So I'm going to change the segments to 2. And by default, it will nicely space them for me. So this was a great tool to use. Just to kind of show you, if they weren't quite where we needed them to be, we could adjust the slide, which will move them up and down. We don't want that. We want them right in the middle. And we could change the pinch, which will spread them out or bring them closer together so that, there we go. We could kind of position them better if we needed to, but with this one, we just need them right there. So we have our 2 rings. So let's see. One, they're right in the right spot, but notice that they are, let's see if I can find a good zoomed in one. You know, they have some shape to them. They're not quite like, it looks like it has one ridge sticking out and then it's kind of tapered back in. So we can't quite do that yet, because if we start to, that's not right. So we need to actually add 3 more, 1 cut on each side. So 4 more cuts. So cut there, cut there, cut there, cut there. Again, there's a lot of different tools that we could use to do this. We could, do another connect. We could do an insert edge loop, but there is a quicker way to do this. If we have our edges right where we need them, we can instead utilize the bevel tool to kind of split them. So I'm going to click bevel and I get this little dialog box up and it looks kind of weird at first, like what just happened? Let's start to play with this. So I'm just going to click and we can see that what the fraction does is it kind of brings them closer together. But I don't want them as just, 2. I still need that center one. So I'm going to up the segments to 2. And it will put that center line in for me. So this is something I do kind of need to eyeball. That's probably going to work. Let's see. That's pretty close, I would say, to what it's supposed to be, like thickness-wise. So that's a fraction 0.1 segment 2. And that should be good. I can exit out of that. So let's actually form that shape, and we can do this just by manipulating our edges. And I do want to do them both at the same time. Since they do look even, I don't want to do one and then do it again. I want to expand them at the same time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get my select tool by hitting Q. I'm going to double click this line. If I double click it, it'll select the loop for me. I'm going to hold shift and double click this one and it will select that loop for me. I'm then going to, I don't need to do any kind of extrudes. I don't need to add any geometry. All I need to do is kind of pull these out. And the one nice thing about cylinders is I can use my scale tool to do this. This is a really easy way to shape cylinders. I don't want to do like this one because it's going to do it on all the dimensions. I don't want that. You can see it's making a very funny shape. What I want to do is hover over this square so that it's only going to do these 2 dimensions. So I can just click and drag and start pulling this out. That might be a little too much. Let me try that again. Maybe something like that. Let's look at our reference. Yeah, that looks pretty good. The only thing I don't like is it might be a little bit sharp where it connects. So let's do that. It might be a little bit sharp where it connects. I might want to come in and bevel those to smooth that transition a little bit. So I'm going to double click, hold shift, double click, hold shift, double click, hold shift, double click. Okay. I'm going to do another bevel. I don't need it nearly as high, so I'm going to maybe try like a 0.1. And I don't need, one segment is fine, that's fine. And it kind of just makes a nice smoother transition. You see that? Do I want it that hard on the ends? I could smooth that out too. That looks really sharp. Do you see that? That looks like you could cut yourself on it, and that's not what we really want. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bevel, just a tiny one. Something like that. And I am going to show you something new now. So we have our bevel, but like it still looks kind of weird. Do you see that? Like it's really hard. And I don't want to bevel, 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 bevel and add a whole bunch of cuts. Instead, what we can do is we can change how hard and how soft our edges display themselves. And this is something that you're going to be doing a lot. It's something that you're going to want to kind of get comfortable with and familiar with because it can dramatically change the look of your models. So let me do a quick demo. I'm going to set this aside for now. I'm just going to hide it. And I'm going to create a cube just to kind of show off what this does. It's a little bit easier on a cube. And a sphere. So let me just make these real quick. Again, if you're following along, you don't have to do this part. This is just a little demo to kind of show what we're about to do. So by default, our cube, if we look at it, has we would call this a hard edge. It's very crisp on the edge and they look really sharp. By default, our sphere has soft edges where, you know, there is no obvious differentiation of where those edges are. So hard edge, soft edge. This is what a cube looks like if we change all the edges to soft edges. So I'm just going to go to my edge. I'm going to select all my edges. I'm going to go to mesh display and I'm going to say soften edge. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to basically make it look like there's no real soft thing. It looks really bizarre on a cube, but I think it really helps illustrate the point of what it's doing. If you need to switch it back, we can always select those edges and do a mesh display harden edge, and it will flip it back to hard edges. So what happens if we do it to this sphere? I'm going to select it, mesh display. Let's harden those edges. Look how faceted it looks now because we can see all of those individual edges. So we can control the look of our model and we can get a lot of, I want to say like fake definition, but make our edges look a lot more better by just adjusting hard and soft edges. So let's delete these. I don't need those. Let's bring that steel drum back. So I want to change the hardness and softness of this. I don't want it to be so crisp like that where it kind of breaks right there. So I'm going to go to edge. I'm going to get my select tool. I'm going to double click to select all the way around. I'm going to double click again. I'm then going to go to mesh display. I'm going to soften the edge. And if I deselect, look how much nicer that looks. We get like a much smoother transition there. It doesn't look like I'm going to cut myself if I walk right by it, you know, brush up against it, which is not quite what we want with this barrel. It's not how it's formed. So again, I'm going to select these edges, mesh display, I'm going to soften those edges. It's a small change, but it can dramatically increase the polish on your models. These by default were already soft. If it looks like this though, let me quickly harden them. You can see we get like a very specific definition there. It's not quite the look I want for this barrel though, so I'm going to go ahead and re-soften those. There we go. Not bad. It's pretty low poly too. Only 1,000 tries. But it looks like we have a lot more because we've manipulated those edges. Okay, let's see. Next, we got those. Those were pretty fast. Not too bad. We need to do our lips at the top. And it's a little bit hard to kind of tell what's going on. But if I look at some of the closer ones, what I'm thinking is happening with this model is it is sticking out a little bit. It goes up, over, and then down. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of modeling to kind of get that look. And we're going to use extrudes to make these. So I actually don't want the polygons on the top. So, or the bottom, but I'm going to show you something. No, I'll do both just so we can step through the tools 2 times. So I'm going to just select these faces, double check. Oops, I missed some of them. That's fine. I'm going to delete them. So let me select those and delete them. I don't need them. I want to remake them. So what we're going to need to do is we're first going to need to kind of make it stick out, then up, then over, then back down again. So I'm going to double click to select that. And you can use the extrude tool. What I do tend to use instead though is I just utilize the scale tool and the move tool to do extrudes. It's a little bit faster and I can kind of see what's going on a little bit better. So I'm going to get my scale tool. I'm going to hold down shift to extrude. See that? Extrude. I'm going to click and drag, and I need to be very careful. I'm just going to do it very slightly. And I have to be mindful of knowing that the moment I release, my extrude is done. I don't want to accidentally be like, oh, I messed it up. Let me like push it in. Oh, I messed it up. Let me push it out. Because I technically then extruded a whole bunch of times and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to hold shift, extrude it, and then release. And then if I need to adjust it again, I do not hold the shift down, but I could come in and tweak it after the fact by just doing a general scale. It's a nice little one. It doesn't need to be large. I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to then move to my move tool. Again, hold shift, extrude up. I do have my step snap on to help me a little bit. I have it set to absolute and 1 centimeter so I can get a nice size. I'm then going to extrude inwards, hold shift, extrude, just a little bit more, then hold shift, extrude down with my move tool. Once I'm satisfied with that, I am going to need to fill this in. There's a couple different ways to do that. We could just use the, with the edge selected all the way around, we could do a, always lose it. Sorry, it takes me a moment to find it sometimes. Mesh, fill hole, and it will cap that. The only bad thing is that it does make an n-gon, and we don't want n-gons. Game engines don't like these. So another way that we could just quickly fill this in, oops, let me undo, is if I hold, if I go to my scale tool and hold shift, I can extrude it inwards to a point as close as I can. You see that? There's still a little teeny tiny hole, but I can grab my vertex tool, vertex, select those, and then use the mesh tool, I'm sorry, edit mesh, merge to center, and it will collapse that down to me, for me, to one single vertice. So a couple different ways. This one is a little bit faster if we do not need to control the topology of that on the top. Okay, we got that top going. It is a little bit crunchy, and notice the one downside of extruding is it basically makes hard edges everywhere, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. I can always go back and forth, and since there's just a whole bunch of stuff going on there, I'm just going to use my select to select all of those, and I'm going to soften them. Mesh display, soften edge. Even if I ultimately don't need them all soft, I can then come in and reharden this edge a little bit faster than trying to select all the individual little pieces. So we got that. Okay. If we look though, we might want to do a little bit of beveling. Even with the soft edge, it's a little bit too much. I'm going to just, again, double click, get those three, do a bevel, maybe not quite so big, maybe like a 3. And they are hard-edged bevels, so let's go in and fix that hardness, softness. So let me just select all of them. Mesh display, soften edge. And we have a nice top. All right. It would be good practice just to remodel the bottom. For the sake of the video, I'm not going to do that. We could also say that maybe since the bottom is always going to be on the ground, we don't need it, but you would just use the same technique to model the bottom of this. So what I would recommend is pause the video, go in or rewind it to that part and remodel the bottom for the same exact way. But this video is getting a little bit long. I don't want to take up more time doing that. I would like to move on to just adding a couple of things on the top. So we're not going to go into too crazy detail, but it would be nice to have those little plugs in there. So we're going to kind of fake it a little bit. We're not going to be going into all those little things, but what we can do is we can just use some other cylinders and kind of sink them in. There really isn't a reason to cut them out to try to fit them in, and extrude out. That would make a really messy mesh. We don't need to do that. So I'm just going to create another cylinder. This one does not need to be as big or have as many, subdivision axes. 20 is probably fine. The radius, if we kind of eyeball it, is should be maybe 2 to 3 centimeters. The height we can keep at 2, but we can position this to see how it looks. I'm not concerned about the pivot point because this isn't going to be my final object. So if we move that there, we move it here. We don't have specific dimensions for this, so we do have to kind of just look and eyeball the size of this. And I think it should be a little bit bigger. Let me make a radius of 3. And that'll work, that'll work. Okay. So once I'm ready to start modeling, the first thing I do want to do is freeze its transform, delete its history. I do not need all of those faces on the top and the bottom. So let me hide the steel drum real quick. I'm going to select the cylinder. Tip, if you hit F on the keyboard, it will focus on your object and it can help with rotating and moving too. So like it's like, oh no, where is it? Hit F, it'll focus it for you. Then we can easily select those polygons and delete them. Let's go back to our actual one now. I'm just going to select it in the outliner and hit H to bring it back. And let's form this a little bit better. So again, we're not going to go as crazy detailed, but we can give it a little bit of a shape based on some of these. So I'm actually gonna, let me hide this real quick. I'm gonna grab this bottom one. That doesn't work right. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, I'm gonna sink this one down. There we go. And again, I do have my absolute step snap set to 1 centimeter. I probably want to drop this down to maybe like 0.5 centimeter so I can get some nice sizes. Okay, I'm going to hold Shift and extrude it up a little. I'm then going to use the scale tool to kind of pull it in. Hold Shift, or go back to move, hold Shift to extrude it up. Hold Shift, extrude it in, move tool, extrude it downwards. And then I'm going to get my scale tool, extrude it inwards, as pretty close, and then just select those little vertices and do my edit mesh merge to center to collapse it down. It is very faceted, so what I do need to do is select all of those edges and do a mesh display soften edge. I might re-harden this edge. Edit mesh, display, harden edge. Same thing. I would either need to bevel these or just harden them. It's so small though that I think I'm just going to keep them hard. That looks good. I do need one on the other side, and you know what? That other little one, it's pretty close looking, so all I'm going to do, like, there's no real reason to remodel it. I'm going to grab this one, Control D to duplicate. Get my move tool, slide it over here. Get my scale tool. I'm going to scale it just on these axes first, and then maybe make it just a little bit smaller. That's pretty good looking. The last step is going to be to combine these all together. We don't want to group them. We want it to be all underneath steel drum. The reason is that we don't want to import things into Painter that are little tiny objects that are just grouped together. It doesn't work very well. We also don't want to import them into game engines as a whole bunch of little tiny objects. It's really obnoxious to open up an object in Unity and it's made of 100 little sub pieces because it does import those all in separately. So let's combine these together into a single object. I'm going to get my select. I usually do this in the outliner because I know what I want a little bit easier. I'm going to hold Shift to select the P cylinder and the steel drum. I did do this in a specific order. If I hold Shift and click Combine over here, I can pull up its dialog box. The reason I'm doing this is I want to make sure that I know what the pivot position is. And there are a couple options. The first one, the reason I selected the steel drum last is I can have the pivot position of our combined object be set to the last object selected. If I do that, it does put it at the origin. Downside, it renamed it some weird name. But we can always rename that. What if we forget though? Like we have a whole bunch of things and we totally forgot to rename or move them and select them in the right order. We could always just have the pivot position set to world origin. It does name it based off of the first thing we have selected, so that might be a little bit easier to work with. So at least you kind of know what you're dealing with. But just beware. I did that. I found that by holding down Shift and then clicking Combine, and it pulled up this box so I can choose the pivot position. All right, so you might have noticed it got really messy over here, and it kept all of this weird information. The reason is this has to do with our attribute editor, because if we go over to the Poly Unite node, this is where we took all of our stuff and combined them into this. So it needs those things because we still have the node that it's based off of. So this is really messy. We don't want to keep this stuff. This can cause problems later if we forget to deal with it. So what we want to do, we want to select Steel Drum 1. We want to hold Shift and select all of these. Just select them all. Then we want to delete out its history. And it usually is pretty good about deleting out all of those extra little things we don't need. Every once in a while, we might have a weird random one left over that's empty, and as long as you did your delete history, it is fine then to delete that. I don't really want to call this Steel Drum 1. I can now fix its name to Steel Drum, and we have our model collapsed together. All right, and that's it. That is all I have for this demo. Again, very simple model, but we could go ahead and push those finer details and we instantly have something that looks a lot more polished by adding bevels and working with that harden edge and soften edge. Some other things to keep in mind is we do want to make sure our pivot point is where it needs to be by the end, and it should be in the bottom of the object. I will have some other videos that go over modeling some other simple objects that will go over some other tools and techniques.